Hello, everyone, from wherever you are in the world, and thanks for joining this virtual event put on by the International Churchill Society. My name is Justin Reash. I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society here in the United States, and I'm the Program Director of the National Churchill Leadership Center at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Now, before I introduce my esteemed guests, I would like to remind you of three things. This conversation is being recorded per usual and will be uploaded to the Society's YouTube page in the coming days. Second, we would love to hear from you and answer your questions. So please ask your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll try to answer as many as possible after my discussion with Alan and later on in the program. And lastly, if you're not a member of the International Churchill Society, I strongly encourage you to become one. You can join our ranks by clicking the link that will shortly be put into the chat of this conversation. So today we continue a growing series of virtual events marking the 80th anniversaries of key moments of World War II. Last month, we spoke with Nigel Hamilton on the Battle of El Alamein. And today we are revisiting the Casablanca conference between Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt that occurred 80 years ago this month. The conference was the first meeting between the two leaders in a theater of war and took place immediately after the successful joint invasion of North Africa. The conference was meant to plan the next steps in the ultimate victory of Germany and Japan. These steps would follow a policy of unconditional surrender, which was announced by Roosevelt in a press conference during the Casablanca conference. What did this policy mean? Would this harden the resolve of the Germans and Japanese, or would it make them think that defeat was inevitable? I'll be asking these questions and many more to my guest, Alan Packwood, OBE. Alan is the director of the Churchill Archive Center at Churchill College, Cambridge. And I asked Alan to join me in this conversation because he addresses the Casablanca conference in his masterly book titled How Churchill Waged War. And you can buy this book at the link that we will provide in the chat shortly. Alan, thank you very much for your time.
Well, Justin, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back speaking on this channel to an ICS audience. And I'm really delighted that you've invited me to speak about the Casablanca conference, because I think it's an event that is often overlooked, or at least overshadowed, by the big free conferences that come later in the war: Tehran in 1944, Yalta and Potsdam in 1945. But as I hope I can show in the time allowed to us, actually Casablanca was vital in setting the direction of the war, and as you've just implied, in cementing the special relationship between Britain and the United States and the personal relationship between Churchill and President Roosevelt.
Alan, let's begin by asking the question, or having you, please set the scene of the conference. Why was it needed? Why Casablanca? And what was the general atmosphere like when FDR and Churchill arrived in Morocco?
Well, those are huge questions. So the Casablanca conference took place over a 2-week period between the 14th and the 24th of January, 1943, 80 years ago. And as you said in your introduction, it's significant because it is the first meeting between President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill and their respective political and military teams to take place after the deployment of American troops in the West, because it comes in the immediate aftermath of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, which had taken place in November 1942, with landings on the Atlantic seaboard, African Atlantic seaboard in Morocco, and the Mediterranean coast in Algeria. So the conference is not named for the movie, which of course was produced in 1942 as a piece of wartime propaganda, but this was an opportunity for Roosevelt and Churchill to escape from Washington, to get out of London, and actually come and see their combined forces in action. And I think really the conference was needed for a number of reasons, but I'm going to highlight three. There was a need, I think, to coordinate the immediate military situation. There was a need to deal with the political situation that followed from that in North Africa. And finally, there was a growing need to determine the longer term military strategy and to resolve the thorny question of what would happen next. So let me take those one at a time. In terms of the immediate military situation, General Eisenhower had led the landings in Morocco and Algeria, and of course he was now pushing into Tunisia, pushing eastwards. His ultimate aim was to link up with the British and Imperial armies commanded by Generals Alexander and Montgomery that had defeated Rommel at the Second Battle of El Alamein in November 1942, and which were now pushing the Germans westward. So discussions needed to take place on how best to coordinate those two approaches, how best to squeeze the Germans with a view to pushing them completely out of Africa. Then there's the political situation, which is complicating things. In attacking French North Africa, the Anglo-American allies had selected a deliberately soft target, and also a nominally neutral one, because Vichy France was not one of the Axis powers. In the words of Eisenhower, writing later, we were invading a neutral country to create a friend. And of course, the hope of the British and Americans was that they would be welcomed as liberators and that French North Africa would rise up and make common cause with them against the Axis powers. And the problem was that that did not really happen. The resistance did attempt a coup in Algiers, but not particularly successfully. And the landing forces in both Morocco and Algeria faced actually quite stiff opposition from Vichy French forces. Now, that then posed Eisenhower with a problem, and it led him to offer deals aimed at winning over local Vichy leaders and their forces. And most notably, of course, and most controversially, by recognizing Admiral Darlan, the former commander of the French Navy, and recognizing him as High Commissioner for France for North and West Africa. Now, Darlan, of course, had been a member of Petain's Vichy government, and so was seen as a fascist fellow traveller by many, including, I think, by Churchill, who had not forgiven him for his role in refusing to surrender the French fleet in July 1940. And Darlan's appointment did not play well to British and American audiences. And of course, it absolutely infuriated Charles de Gaulle as leader of the Free French forces. Now, Darlan was subsequently, and perhaps not surprisingly, assassinated. He was replaced by General Henry Giraud, who'd escaped from German captivity. So he wasn't seen as someone tainted by the Vichy regime, but he lacked the support of either the Free French or the former Vichy forces in North Africa. And he was consequently dismissed by de Gaulle as someone who held no position at all. And that meant that there was a political power vacuum in North Africa, in French North Africa, that needed dealing with. And Churchill summarizes this very well in a letter he sends back to Clementine, where he writes, "Many of these Frenchmen hate each other far more than they do the Germans." So there was the immediate military situation, there's the immediate political situation, but there's also a growing need to determine the longer term military strategy. In previous Allied conversations, the Americans, and perhaps especially their Chief of Staff, General Marshall, had seen Operation Torch and the invasion of French North Africa as a temporary diversion from the main theatre of war. And Marshall argued very strongly that the main theatre of war needed to be northwestern Europe. The quickest way to Berlin was through France. So the landings in North Africa allowed for engagement with the enemy while buying time for sufficient forces to be built up for an attack against France. But the British had a very different view. They felt that the German strength in France, at least for the time being, limited the possibility of large-scale operations across the Channel, and that the Allies should therefore follow up their success in North Africa by seizing back control of the Mediterranean. And of course, you can argue that there were advantages for the British imperial position in doing this, given British holdings in the Middle East and the quickest route to India being through the Mediterranean. But even then, the British planners were divided amongst themselves over what the next step should be in the Mediterranean, and whether North Africa should be followed up by attacking Sardinia or Sicily. So Churchill goes into Casablanca aware that there would be difficult decisions with the Americans over strategy. And for once, and perhaps uncharacteristically, he advised his team to follow a policy of gradual persuasion, likening it to the dripping of water on stone. So that's what they were there to discuss. Now, you want me also then to go on and talk a little bit about who was there and the atmosphere?
Yeah, indeed. You know, not just FDR, not just Churchill, who was with them?
Okay, so the conference is held at the Anther Hotel in Casablanca, which is why it's sometimes referred to as the Anther Conference. And I think what you have to do is to picture a secure hotel compound on the edge of Casablanca, surrounded by barbed wire, patrolled by largely American sentries, with several expensive villas in the hotel grounds, which have been requisitioned for the use of the president, of Churchill, Giraud, de Gaulle, and the other principal players. And if you visit the site now, which I was lucky enough to do 5 years ago for the 75th anniversary, what you find is that the hotel, sadly, is no longer there. It's been demolished, but the villas are still there. And Churchill's villa, the one he used, is now occupied by the US consulate. And we were able to go in and see the room where Churchill has his map room. So who attends Casablanca then? Well, obviously Churchill. Actually, he comes out first, I think, on the 12th of January. And he comes out in his Commando aircraft. And his Commando aircraft is actually a specially converted Liberator II bomber. I think it highlights how dangerous, actually, international travel was during the war, and the risks that Churchill and Roosevelt were taking in attending these conferences. Because there's a wonderful passage in Churchill's war memoirs where he writes about traveling in the Commando, and he writes, in order to heat the Commando, they had established a petrol engine inside, which generated fumes and raised various heating points to very high temperatures. I was woken up at 2 in the morning when we were over the Atlantic, 500 miles from anywhere, by one of these heating points burning my toes. And it looked to me as if it might soon get red hot and light the blankets. I ordered all heating to be turned off, and we went back to rest, shivering in the ice-cold winter air about 8,000 feet up, at which we had to fly to be above the clouds. I am bound to say this struck me as rather an unpleasant moment. And actually that Commando aircraft, that converted Liberator bomber, is actually lost over the Atlantic at the end of the Second World War. Fortunately, not with Churchill in it on that trip. But of course, Churchill comes with his own team, men like General Pugisme, his chief of staff, or Colonel Ian Jacob, who's a member of his war secretariat and keeps a really valuable diary of the conference. And he's joined in Casablanca by his son Randolph, by Harold Macmillan, the British politician, future prime minister, who's the resident minister in Algiers. He comes with Lord Levers, who's the Minister of War Transport, which I think tells you that shipping is going to be key to a lot of their discussions about how to conduct the war. Field Marshal Sir John Dill flies in from Washington, where he's head of the British Joint Staff Mission in DC, and he's a key figure in brokering deals between the American and British military. And then the British Chiefs of Staff are all there. So you have the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Allenbrook. You have the Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Peter Portal. You have First Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound, and the head of combined operations, Admiral Mountbatten. And in addition, and accompanying them, you have a huge planning staff that comes complete with its own well-equipped mobile headquarters, which is the converted passenger ship HMS Bululu, which is moored in Casablanca harbour. So that's the British delegation. The American delegation arrives slightly later. It includes President Roosevelt, General Marshall, Admirals King and Leahy, General Arnold for the US Air Force, Averell Harriman, and like Churchill, FDR has his son Elliot present. And then in addition to those flying in from London and Washington, DC, you also have the local theatre commanders being summoned to coordinate the military operations. So Eisenhower and Clark for the Americans and Alexander for the British. I think Patton is also there. Giraud, of course, is present, and de Gaulle is belatedly dragged kicking and screaming to the conference by urgent entreaties from Churchill, who threatens to cut him off from Allied support if he doesn't attend. So you can see it is an incredible gathering. And you could argue that it's a huge missed opportunity for the Germans, because if they managed to hit the Casablanca conference, they could have knocked out most of the Allied high command. The one omission that I think it's worth mentioning, the one empty seat around that conference table, is Stalin. Now, he'd been invited, but declined on the grounds that he was needed at home to oversee the Russian offensive that was taking place at Stalingrad. Obviously, no doubt that Stalingrad is taking place. It is a hugely significant moment, but it's also noticeable, of course, if you look at later wartime conferences, that Stalin never travels outside of Russian-controlled areas to meet his allies. He always makes them come to him. So perhaps it's not surprising that he doesn't go. Certainly his absence, I think, has an impact on Churchill and Roosevelt, and particularly on the messages that they want to send out at the end of the conference. Harold Macmillan writes in his diary that Casablanca was like a meeting of two emperors in the late Roman period, and that the presence of the Red Emperor, meaning Stalin, would have made the thing perfect. The atmosphere is also described by Macmillan as a mixture between a cruise, a summer school, and a conference. It's certainly true that Churchill loved these opportunities of getting out of London, going out, being able to see troops, being able to discuss things with allies at high levels. Alan Brooke spends breaks in the conference indulging his passion for ornithology, for bird watching. But there wasn't a huge amount of spare time, with the combined chiefs of staff in a regular session and the president and the prime minister holding parallel, though noticeably less minuted, political conversations, and then everyone coming together to take the sort of main decisions at the plenary sessions.
And can you explain what those two separate, the allies who are now meeting in wartime for the first time, talk about what they both wanted out of this conference, what were their aims, and then what was achieved?
Okay. Well, as I said earlier, I mean, I think.
Or were there did they come in with separate aims? Because as you know, when Churchill visited the White House in 41, December 41, the American staff told the British staff, Germany is our first, we should conquer Germany first. So they had already gotten over that hurdle of the British fear that the Americans were going to, prioritize the Pacific. So they obviously were already on the same plane, because they invaded North Africa together. But were there any differences of goals for the conference?
I think there are clear differences going in. I mean, they have common short-term aims, but where there are clear differences is in the longer-term aim and the longer-term strategy. So let's break that down. If we look at the sort of the short term first, in terms of what Casablanca achieves, it does resolve, I think, the immediate strategy for what would become the Tunisian campaign. It creates a unified Allied command by establishing that the British General Alexander, would serve as deputy to Eisenhower. And it does lead to a sort of greater coordination of how that campaign, how that next phase of the campaign in North Africa is going to be conducted. It does also, at least temporarily, resolve the political situation by enforcing what Roosevelt and Churchill joke about as a shotgun wedding between General Henry Giraud and de Gaulle. Roosevelt makes it clear from the beginning of the conference that he wants de Gaulle to attend, and he expects Churchill to be able to deliver him. But de Gaulle, of course, refuses Churchill's initial invitations, arguing that while he was prepared to meet Giraud in French territory, he's reluctant to do so at a meeting of the Allies who might press him to some compromise that he doesn't want to make. So it takes great effort by Eden and by Churchill and the British War Cabinet to get the French general to reconsider. And in the end, Churchill sends a telegram that makes it very clear that if, with your eyes open, you reject this unique opportunity, the consequences to the future of the fighting French movement cannot be but grave in the extreme. Because Churchill knows that if de Gaulle becomes persona non grata with the Americans, then the British might have to abandon him. So in the end, de Gaulle sort of bows to the inevitable, swallows his pride, and he flies out for that famous symbolic photo call and handshake with Giraud, which takes place just before the final press conference on the 24th of January. But according to Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, and other sources, that press conference was preceded by a really awkward meeting between Churchill and de Gaulle. And Moran records in his diary how after that meeting, Churchill said of de Gaulle, his country has given up fighting. He himself is a refugee. And if we turn him down, he's finished. Well, just look at him. Look at him. He might be Stalin with 200 divisions behind his words. And I think it's also at that meeting between Churchill and de Gaulle that Churchill is supposed to have said to the French general, si vous m'obstaculerez, je vous liquiderai. De Gaulle doesn't actually mention that in his memoirs, but he tactfully refers to the meeting as the most ingracious he ever had with Churchill. The upshot of all of that, of course, is that there is effectively a truce between de Gaulle and Giraud, and they briefly serve as co-presidents of the Free French Forces before Giraud is ultimately ousted by de Gaulle. So on those immediate issues, I think you do get some agreement and resolution. The big discussion, of course, was about the future strategy. And here, as you've just implied, there were really significant differences between the members of the combined chiefs of staff. So Admiral King for the Americans still felt that the Pacific theatre should have the first charge on all resources, while General Marshall favours building up for an invasion of France rather than continued fighting in the Mediterranean. The British planners are clear on the Mediterranean, but they're divided over whether the next target should be Sardinia or Sicily. What's Churchill's view? Well, according to Ian Jacob in his diary, Churchill knew his mind. He wanted the cleansing of the North African shore to be followed by the capture of Sicily. He wanted the reconquest of Burma, and he wanted the invasion of northern France on a moderate scale, perhaps. And as Jacob puts it, he was indulging to the full in his usual pastime of having his cake and eating it, or trying to. So, in the end, actually, you have these discussions over several days between the combined chiefs of staff. And in the end, a consensus on future operations is reached by Monday, the 18th of January. So 80 years ago, this very day. And what's decided in the end is that the easier opportunities in the Mediterranean versus the time it's going to take to build up huge forces for an operation against France lead to American agreement with the British strategy and a decision that the next step can be Sicily, although the Americans don't commit themselves beyond that. So the next operations would be the capture of Sicily, while at the same time preparing forces and assembling landing craft in England for a thrust across the Channel in the event that the German strength in France decreases, because they're being pulled down into Italy, either through withdrawal of her troops or because of an internal collapse. And General Brooke recorded in his diary that that was a complete acceptance of the British strategy, and he could hardly believe our luck. Now, there were some other decisions, significant decisions. One, of course, on the bombing of Germany, because you have American bomber forces building up in the UK, and it was agreed that the United States 8th Bomber Command and the RAF's Bomber Command would collaborate even more tightly with an increased tempo and weight of daylight and night attacks on Germany that would lead to greatly increased material and morale damage and rapidly deplete German fighter strength. And that aim, that escalation of bombing against Germany and acceptance of bombing of German industrial targets becomes the Casablanca Directive on aerial bombing. And it aims at undermining the morale of the German people to a point where their capacity for armed resistance is fatally weakened. So this is the moment where Roosevelt and Churchill commit to giving it back to Germany significantly through very heavy bombing of Germany. And I think in that directive, you can see Churchill and Roosevelt sending a message to Stalin, because they know that the Russian leader desperately wants a second front in northwestern Europe to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. And of course, at Casablanca, they've just decided on continuing with the Mediterranean strategy, at least for a while. And therefore, they're desperate to show that there are other ways in which they're taking the offensive to the Germans. And principal one of those is through aerial bombing. Churchill also gives his support to operations in Burma once resources are available. I think he's very keen to rebut sort of suggestions that the British are not as committed to the war in the Far East as the United States. And I think then, in essence, what you see at Casablanca is that some really important decisions are taken about the future direction of the war that are going to have repercussions for the next couple of years. It's the Casablanca conference that prioritizes Italy over Germany in 1943, effectively accepting, therefore, that D-Day cannot really happen before 1944. And it's Casablanca that unleashes the full force of Allied aerial bombardment against Germany. And of course, it's also at Casablanca that the Allied policy of unconditional surrender is adopted.
And let's get into that. So unconditional surrender, you write in your book. Let's say, for those who haven't read the book, excuse me, the title of the chapter in which Alan discusses unconditional surrender, the Casablanca Conference, is titled Masterstroke or Millstone. Tell us about unconditional surrender, how it came about, whose idea was it, and why did you title your chapter with that quite interesting question?
Okay, well, unconditional surrender, I suppose, is what it sounds like. It is the Allies launching a policy whereby they state very publicly that the only surrender that they're going to accept from the Axis powers is an unconditional one. In other words, there can be no negotiated peace settlement with Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, or Imperial Japan. And President Roosevelt announces this policy to the world at the press conference at the end of the Casablanca meeting on the 24th of January, 1943. And he does so by referencing the US Civil War general Ulysses S. Grant, subsequently president. And he reminds his audience that Grant had been nicknamed Unconditional Surrender Grant. According to the Times newspaper correspondent who was out there covering the conference, today, Mr. Roosevelt explained with emphasis that meant unconditional surrender by Germany, Italy, and Japan. and that meant a reasonable assurance of a future world peace. It did not mean, he, Roosevelt, explained with the same emphasis, the destruction of the populace of those countries, but rather the destruction of the philosophies in those countries based on fear and hate and the subjugation of other peoples. It was then that the president suggested, as if it were a happy thought that had just occurred to him, that we might call this the Unconditional Surrender Meeting. So Roosevelt labeling the whole conference the Unconditional Surrender Conference. Now, of course, the whole concept of unconditional surrender is one that's been very fiercely debated, both at the time and since, with opponents saying that it was counterproductive and that it ran the risk of prolonging the war because it took away all hope and therefore all motivation from the Germans and Japanese that they could simply change their leadership and then negotiate a peace. In his war memoirs, Churchill writes that the president's announcement was a surprise to him at the press conference. That was certainly disingenuous, as Churchill later had to admit, because if you look at the minutes for the Casablanca conference, you can see that unconditional surrender is certainly discussed in some of the sessions. It's discussed by the Prime Minister and the President in the plenary sessions. And at one point, Churchill even sends a telegram back to his war cabinet in London, asking them to approve the announcement of unconditional surrender and the concept. And the reply of the British war cabinet is, yes, they approve, but it should be extended to include Italy as well as Germany or Japan, because it's felt that this declaration that we're only going to accept unconditional surrender might actually weaken Italian morale and resolve. So come back to your question, what were Churchill and Roosevelt really trying to do by promoting this idea? I think it's a classic example of the policy having to be seen in the context of the time, in the context of the moment, in the context of January 1943. And I think by stating that aim of unconditional surrender so publicly, they were surely sending a message to Stalin, a message that no separate peace would be contemplated. In a way, it's about reassuring their absent ally, and it's also about making sure that the Russians, fresh from success at Stalingrad, don't perhaps negotiate an independent peace themselves. So it's about sending that message to Stalin, and as with aerial bombing, it's about demonstrating the strength of their commitment to the alliance, I think. And doing so, of course, in the knowledge that the Russians are bearing a huge burden at Stalingrad and are both inflicting and receiving huge losses. And it's also done, of course, in the knowledge that they, Churchill and Roosevelt, have just delayed any operation in northwestern France of the sort that Stalin might want. I think it was probably also in January 1943 aimed at the domestic audiences in Britain, in the United States, and in France, where there had been considerable opposition to the deal with Darlan and this idea of negotiating with fascists or with fascist fellow travelers. And furthermore, I think it's also likely to have been motivated, at least on a personal level, by the news that Churchill and Roosevelt were starting to receive about the extent of the Holocaust, particularly in Eastern Europe, and about the barbarity of the Nazi regime. So I think, it's and this idea of sort of therefore masterstroke or millstone, clearly in those terms, I think you can understand why unconditional surrender is announced, and I think you can understand why it works in January 1943. The millstone element comes later, because to what extent does that policy work when you reach the end game of the Second World War, and where actually there might be opportunities to end the conflict earlier or to divide the Allies and by negotiating. And it's interesting that if Churchill and Roosevelt were indeed doing this in part because of Stalin and to reassure Stalin, it's interesting that when you get to the Tehran conference, Stalin makes it very clear that he's not wedded to the concept of unconditional surrender, and that actually he is prepared to, to act in the moment and to negotiate where necessary. So the danger, and this is the criticism of the policy, and it's criticism at the time. Maurice Hankey, who was a former cabinet minister and former head of the British Civil Service, and Labour MPs like Richard Stokes, they're saying openly at the time that an unconditional surrender is a mistake. However, whether you can really argue that that it prolonged the war, I doubt. I mean, in both Germany and Japan, their grip was such on their countries by 1945 that it's difficult to see that a position of unconditional surrender that made any difference. Perhaps it would have made a difference if Operation Valkyrie had been successful and Hitler would have been assassinated. But then you get into the realm of counterfactuals.
Exactly. And to your point, I just finished Antony Beevor's Berlin, and the description of the Berlin residents who are so astonished by how close the Russians are when they're crossing the Oder is because of the grip of the propaganda of the Nazi regime. And so one follow-up question in terms of kind of the the whimsical nature of this announcement. You write in your book, FDR says it out loud and says it in an interview, but then you refer to the minutes that it was clearly discussed at the conference. Do you think Churchill, even though it was discussed, do you think he wasn't expecting FDR to announce it in such a way, and that more conversation was needed between them?
I think he wasn't expecting him to announce it publicly at the end of the conference, and I think I'm not sure that there was room for further discussion between them. I think they did both agree on the importance of a policy of unconditional surrender at this point, and they'd reached agreement on it. I think what caught Churchill out was he wasn't expecting Roosevelt to announce it. So then why does Roosevelt announce it? Part of that, of course, may be that it gives him something dramatic to announce at the end of the conference, because an awful lot of what they had been discussing in these sessions at Casablanca was, of course, secret. It was their future military strategy. They're not going to reveal to the world that their next step is going to be Sicily. They're not going to reveal their stepping up aerial bombing. They're not going to reveal their planning for the Far East or the decisions that have been reached about shipping at Casablanca. So unconditional surrender is the sort of thing that obviously the press, the public are going to be able to latch onto, and they're going to see it as a concrete thing coming out of this meeting. And of course, we know that Roosevelt liked these grand gestures. You have the Atlantic Charter in 1941. You have, and I think you have to see the unconditional surrender policy in the same sort of light.
So we have some wonderful questions, and Alan, before we get into those from the audience, let's briefly talk about the famous painting that Churchill produced during his visit to Casablanca. Tell us a little bit about the painting, who it was given to, and what its current life is today.
In as much as we know. So this is a really interesting postscript to the Casablanca conference. Churchill decides at the end of the conference that he wants to take President Roosevelt, his new friend, to Marrakesh, which is a place that Churchill loved. It's a place where since the early 1930s, he's been going to regularly to paint. And he wants to take Roosevelt to show him the sunset over the Atlas Mountains. So at the end of the conference, they drive out to Marrakesh. They stay in a villa, and indeed Roosevelt is carried to the top of a tower where he sits alongside Churchill, and they watch the sunset together, giving a very warm glow to Anglo-American relations. I think it's a high point in terms of certainly in terms of their personal relationship. And the next day, Roosevelt departs, but Churchill stays on for a few hours, and he goes out and he paints the view from the tower, which is a view of the Koutoubia Mosque in Marrakesh. It's the only painting that he does during the Second World War, and I think Justin's just put it up on the screen for you. And it does have a really interesting afterlife. As you would expect, he chooses to give this painting to President Roosevelt as a memento of their time together in Marrakesh and their time together at the Casablanca conference. Thereafter, it is ultimately sold by the Roosevelt family, and it ended up recently in the hands of the Hollywood A-listers Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. But of course, in the aftermath of their divorce, it has since been sold again. And I have to say, I'm afraid I don't know where it is now. But it is certainly the single most valuable Churchill painting when it comes up at auction, because of this wonderful provenance and because it's the only painting he did as wartime Prime Minister.
Alan, let's get into the questions. Thank you, everyone, for attending and for submitting. So I'm going to start. I'm going to invoke some executive privilege. I'm going to ask the question that was submitted by my father. He asks, as the Battle of Atlantic was still ongoing during the conference in Casablanca, what measures were taken by the U.S. Navy and British Navy to ensure the safe arrival of Churchill and Roosevelt? What, to your knowledge?
Well, I can't comment on Roosevelt, unfortunately, but obviously with Churchill, they decide not to send him by sea. So he comes in by air using his converted Commando Liberator bomber. It's still high risk, but perhaps not as high risk as braving the U-boat infested waters of the Atlantic. I'm sure that for both Churchill and Roosevelt, there would also have been elaborate deception plans in place to give, so as you know, to lead the Axis powers not to think that that Churchill and Roosevelt are going to appear together in Casablanca. Although they're in Morocco for such a long time that I think it must have been difficult to maintain that. And by the end of the conference, it must have been pretty clear where they were, and that must have been a security nightmare for the people around the president and the Prime Minister. But you're absolutely right to mention the Battle of the Atlantic, and of course it's one of the areas I haven't mentioned so far, but it was, of course, something that underpinned and underlay all of the discussions that were taking place at Casablanca, because the key thing, of course, is that until you've resolved the Battle of the Atlantic, it is very difficult to get all of the resources in place to support major campaigns, whether in the Mediterranean theatre or against France, and certainly to launch an invasion of France from, or a liberation of France from the UK, is something you can't really contemplate until you've got control of the Atlantic and until you can guarantee that you can get forces across. So the Battle of the Atlantic is something that underpins a lot of the debates at Casablanca, and Roosevelt and Churchill have huge discussions about shipping and logistics. And the only other thing I would say is that you should be extremely proud of your son, who's doing a fantastic job running the International Churchill Society and the National Churchill Library at National Churchill Center at George Washington University.
Alan, thank you. A free compliment indeed. Let's divert for a second. Niels would like to know, is it an original Winston Churchill painting behind you, hanging behind you, Alan?
It's a really good question. I would love to be able to say that it is an original Winston Churchill painting. It is actually a very clever copy of a Churchill painting that was very kindly presented to me by the members of the society after the Blenheim conference in 2015. And I think is a fitting backdrop for these discussions.
So a few questions about one from Maury, one from Eric, regarding what information the Allies had about the Nazi final solution and the concentration camps that had been set up years before. And you briefly touched on it, but is there anything further you could share in terms of what information they had, and how did that feed into, if any, at that point, the overall, policy direction of the war?
Okay, I mean, it's a really good question. Now, of course, Churchill had been commenting on the Nazi policy of persecuting and interning the Jews and other groups since from before the Second World War started. But you're certainly seeing an intensification of that by January 1943, and you're starting to see. I mean, by this point, you've had the Wannsee Conference. The Germans are now implementing the genocide of the Holocaust in a horrible, unrestrained way in Eastern Europe, and reports of that are clearly now getting back to Churchill and Roosevelt through many different sources, and it's becoming clear to them that this is, something different, that this is a whole-scale genocide. It's very difficult, at least from the sources that I've seen, to link that directly to policy, but I think you can see it. And partly, of course, because the meetings between Roosevelt and Churchill, their political meetings at Casablanca, are not minuted. Roosevelt preferred to have unminuted discussions. But I think you can clearly see it in the language that they are then using in the immediate aftermath of the conference, and in the language that Roosevelt uses particularly to justify the policy of unconditional surrender. So I'm fairly convinced that it is feeding in and affecting policy.
Yeah. So a question from Steve Shore. He asks, David M. Kennedy, in his book Freedom from Fear, states that the demand for unconditional surrender agreed upon at Casablanca reflected American weakness in relation to Britain in 1943. Do you agree?
Oh, it would be interesting to know on what grounds the feeling was that it reflected American weakness. It is a suggestion there is a fear on the American side that the British themselves would seek some negotiated settlement with the Germans. In which case, I mean, I think that's highly unlikely. I mean, Churchill has been working since becoming wartime prime minister, if not before becoming wartime prime minister, when he was first Lord of the Admiralty, to bring the Americans into the war. It's very clear to the British chiefs of staff and the British planners from the fall of France onwards that their best hope of real victory in the war is dependent on the American alliance, and is dependent on further American support, material support, financial support, but ultimately Churchill's hope, of course, is full military support. So this moment in Casablanca of the two armies fighting side by side, or in fact fighting together as a unified force, is something that he's been working for so long. So I mean, the risks, and Churchill's strategy in the Far East is entirely dependent on America being able to take the lead in the Pacific. So I don't think there is a an argument to say that Churchill would have looked to negotiate some sort of separate peace apart from the Americans. I mean, he was absolutely committed to the special relationship and to building that up, and goes out of his way at Casablanca to try and stress to the Americans that we're in it right to the very end in terms of the war against Japan. In terms of American weakness, I mean, of course, American forces are still unproved at this point, and perhaps, they've been a little bit sort of stung by the reception that they've received from the French Vichy forces in North Africa, where I think they probably expected the landings to be easier than they were. So it may be a response to that the president now feels that he has to send out a very clear message that, this was just the first step. Just because it's been difficult doesn't mean that we're now going to weaken or tire. So I suppose there may be something in it from that angle.
Alan Saltman asked, do you agree that the conference was the apex of Churchill's time as prime minister, because Roosevelt was much more independent thereafter? I think that's a pretty interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You would normally, I suppose, argue that the apex of Churchill's premiership really comes in 1941 in terms of having weathered the Battle of Britain, having weathered the Blitz, having secured the Grand Alliance with the Soviet Union and the United States, and that he's riding high. I mean, actually, 1942, the first half of 1942 was a very bad year for him, with 2 votes of no confidence in the British Parliament, even though he won them easily. But certainly with mounting public and press criticism of his premiership. I suppose the victory at El Alamein in November 1942, and then the Torch landings allow him really to say that this is the end of the beginning, and that the tide is now turning. I think you can certainly make the case for it being a high point in the Anglo-American relationship, and a key moment where the British still are clearly exerting a powerful influence on the Americans in terms of the direction of the war, partly because we've already got more forces engaged in the conflict and more experience of the conflict at that point. So yes, I think you probably could see January 1943 as a high point, certainly in terms of Churchill's relationship with the United States. It might be more complicated in terms of the sort of British domestic front, where you would have said that the high point came earlier.
Interesting question. This is from Susie Ellicott. Some historians seem to think Churchill's chief aim, beyond, of course, protecting England and defeating Germany, was to protect the empire. Would you agree? And Alan, as you and I both know, conversations now around Churchill's, ultimate goal in winning the war and being a leader have come into question. Do you think this is a fair question, a fair assessment of that? Saving the empire was the ultimate goal?
Well, I mean, what you have to do, of course, is to put yourself back in Churchill's shoes in the Second World War. And he is not just British Prime Minister. He is also Prime Minister of the British Empire. So for him, there is no conflict between those 2 things. His role is to act as the leader of Britain and her empire. And Churchill states very clearly in 1942, after the victory at El Alamein, that he's not become the King's First Minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. And his view or his ideal scenario for the post-war world is to try and make sure that Britain emerges from the Second World War with her empire intact. Now, of course, for all sorts of reasons that we could discuss here, that's not actually possible. And the very fact that Churchill chooses to prioritize the defense of the Atlantic and the defense of the Mediterranean, ultimately, I think, sacrifices the empire in the Far East. But for Churchill, that would be a false question. Of course, he was there to defend the empire because, you know, he was Prime Minister of Britain and her empire, and he saw those as one entity.
That's a very, very astute point. Very astute answer, Alan. You know, providing you know, the point of view of the current day, which, you know, I think is oftentimes very difficult to do for historians in present day, to really try to parse between what we consider you know, a circumstance that we've now had 50 years removed or 80 years removed, whereas trying to consider their, what I would call their today, and understanding how they view something that has changed in the past 70 years, you know, after they had been acting or had died. So indeed, a very, very astute question, or a very astute answer. So last two questions, Alan. I think it's good to ask Charles' question. Although Stalin didn't attend, did he have any representatives in attendance? That's a very specific question.
It's a very good question, and I'm pretty sure the answer is no, that he didn't. This was an Anglo-American conference, and I think it's interesting that, of course, the dynamic would have been changed quite significantly had Russian generals been in those combined staff meetings. And one of the things that the Casablanca conference does so well is to bond together not just Roosevelt and Churchill, but also their subordinates, their key teams, their chiefs of staff. So it creates a unified, combined chiefs of staff. And I'm not sure it would have been so effective in doing that if the Russians had been there in strength.
And last question I'll ask Gary. So Gary, these are long questions. I'm going to try to present it concisely. Apparently during the Casablanca conference, Churchill proposed resurrecting Operation Sledgehammer, which was the original plan to invade Northwest Europe. Apparently he resurrected it. The president immediately agreed, but General Marshall demurred, and there was no follow-up. A, is that accurate? Is Gary's presentation accurate? And B, do you think that because time had passed, and of course General Marshall was in favor of Operation Sledgehammer previously, that it just was not on the table at that time or in the cards?
So that's a great question. And if you want a really detailed answer on that, I think Andrew Roberts's book, Masters and Commanders, which looks at Churchill, Roosevelt, Marshall and Brooke and the debates that they have over wartime strategy at Casablanca and elsewhere, will give you sort of chapter and verse on that and a much more detailed answer on that. I think the answer is that going into the conference, I think Churchill does want to keep his options open. He's still hoping that it will be possible to launch some form of operation against France in late 1943, possibly. And of course, Marshall is very keen to launch as large an operation as quickly as possible. But in their sort of detailed debates, they consider various different options, and there are various different code names for this. There's Bolero, which is the build-up of the forces in the UK. There's Roundup, which is an early name for D-Day. And I think Sledgehammer, what was particularly meant by that, I think, was an operation against the sort of Cherbourg Peninsula, an invasion of the Cherbourg Peninsula, which would be slightly more limited than Roundup. And so they're playing around with these different possibilities and different operations. But what becomes very clear in the detailed conversations they have at Casablanca is that the Americans are not going to be able to get sufficient forces and sufficient material and sufficient landing craft assembled in the UK to mount a really significant invasion of northwest France in 1943. Therefore, if it goes ahead, it's going to be entirely reliant on British forces, to which the British response is they simply don't have the capacity to do it, given that they're already fighting in the Mediterranean and that this operation would take up all of their fighter strength and naval strength. And it's by talking all of this through around the table that they come to the the decision that they will, at least in the short term, seek to capitalize on their gains in North Africa by moving against Italy, in the hope that in doing that, they might be able to knock Italy out of the war, they might be able to drag German forces out of France, and that in turn would then make it easier to attack France. The irony in all of this, of course, is that by taking that decision and by following that strategy, of course, you inevitably further knock back the invasion of France, because you're having to send more resources to North Africa. But I think looking at it holistically, which is what they're able to do at Casablanca and what Casablanca achieves, what they see is that to attack Fortress Europe, to go against the German forces in France, you need control of the seas, you need control of the air, you need a huge buildup of men and material, and you need battle-hardened troops. And I think the decision that they come to is that they don't have those things yet.
Alan, thank you for those still with us. This is the cover of Alan's book. Please go and buy it. Thank you for your time, Alan. Thank you all for joining us. It was recorded. It will be on our YouTube page. And until next time, thanks and take care.
Thank you all so much. Bye.